Hey, welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Rep by Rep Strength Podcast. Today, I'm sitting down with Coach Stewart Young, assistant strength and conditioning coach at University of Kansas. Coach, thanks for joining us today. And go ahead and give us a little intro about where you're at, what you're doing, athletes you're working with, et cetera.
Yeah, thanks, Travis. Thanks for having me. I'm, like you said, I'm currently assistant strength conditioning coach at University of Kansas. I've been here for about 4.5 years now. I work right now directly with track and field and men's golf, and have previously worked with football here. Before I was at here in Kansas, I was at University of Alabama at Birmingham for about 3.5 years, working with a number of sports. I started with baseball and football there. When the football program got cut, I also worked with men's and women's tennis, track and field, women's basketball, and then football again when they brought it back. And then before UAB, I was working at Samford University, also in Birmingham, which is where I went to school. I did softball, women's soccer, women's basketball, women's volleyball there. So in the last little over 10 years that I've been a strength conditioning coach, I've worked with just about every sport, directly in charge of every sport except for men's basketball, and I guess rowing, if that's that's a little less common of an Olympic sport in a lot of colleges. And then I also coach a weightlifting team called True Strength Performance. And so that's a little bit of in-person and a little bit of online kind of combination. It's morphed throughout the years. We're coming up on 2 years of kind of being a little bit more of an official thing. It started as just a hobby and a passion of mine. And as I started learning about weightlifting and getting into it, more of it myself and using it with my teams and athletes, I started to enjoy it a lot more. And so I train and compete as a weightlifter. And then it honestly started with me coaching and training interns and other coaches that I worked with over the years and people that I worked with. And then that's kind of morphed from there into, having people in several different states now that I coach and train that I've met through the strength and conditioning field. And so that's kind of another passion of mine that I like to do as well. So
awesome. Yeah, I think so. Are you USA level 2, level 3?
Yeah, so they it's level 3, but they don't call it level 3 now. So I took the level 1 and level 2 course, and then they kind of renamed it a couple of years ago. So they have a national coach, which is level 3, which is what I have, and then they have an international coach and then a senior international coach. So what they did is they've kind of made it all the top 3 levels dependent upon the athletes that you coach and produce. And so if you produce a certain number of national level athletes that make it to the national championships, then you're a national coach. And then if you get several that they have different criteria for junior, senior, stuff like that, youth. If you get several to international meets and international teams, then you can become an international coach. And then once you've got a certain number, you become a senior international coach. And I want to say there's maybe like 10 of those in the country.
Right.
So yeah, maybe one day we'll get there.
All right. So it's all kind of trying to find that weightlifter that's going to finally get that international for you, basically, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Gotcha. And I've got one girl that's really close now. She's,
is that Kat?
Yeah, Kat. Yeah. So yeah. I started coaching her in 2014. Mm-hmm. She was the first athlete I started coaching at UAB, and she was a freshman undergrad there. And she just emailed me and was like, "Hey, I see you have a weightlifting club." I had a sport club with UAB, and she was like, "Hey, I've done CrossFit, growing up, and I want to get into weightlifting." And I was like, "All right." So we started. And I learned a lot. She stuck with me through a lot. I probably would have fired myself a bunch of times by now, but she stuck with me through a lot and learned, I've learned a lot from her, and she's done really well. I want to say she's got close to 20 national medals now throughout the years that we've been going to competitions and stuff. And she's within about 10 kilos of making an international team next year, a senior international team. So So we'll see. There'll be a couple big meets. The Arnold in March will be a big meet if she wants to do that. She's a full-time physical therapist now. She lives in Lawrence and works in Topeka, so it's nice to have her close by. But she's a full-time physical therapist, so it's not always easy, like training schedule-wise and then competition schedule-wise. So she stays busy. But yeah,
man, that's one of the things. Like I've been following on Instagram what True Strength Performance is doing, and I keep up with your lifters that way, and kind of track their stuff. But that's the other thing that I run into with people who are on all sorts of time constraints. So you may have 30 minutes, 45 minutes with somebody, and what's the most efficient way to get some lifting in and get a lot of quality work is going to be snatches, clean and jerks, and the derivatives. But anyway, I was kind of asking you those questions there because the little debate we've been seeing a little more recently about people talking about training athletes and feeling like such a dichotomy of, must you do trap bar jump shrugs or must you do Olympic lifting? Can there be any gray area, I like to exist in the gray. Like for certain athletes, I've got some that can absolutely do the full Olympic lifts and no issue. Other ones, it's going to be derivatives and pulls from different positions, and other ones, it might be trap bar jump shrugs. But anyway, what are your thoughts? Like going from training specifically Olympic lifters who are going to competitions and athletes, is there a time and a place for both that you've seen, or how does that look for you?
Yeah, I think there's a time and a place for both. The way I approach it with obviously, if you're a weightlifter, that's the sport, so that's what you got to do. But as an athlete, I approach it from just kind of a standpoint of one, it's a skill and technique, first of all. So that's kind of how I approach it with them. It can have, the Olympic movements can have a lot of benefits, when it comes to strength and power and force production and force, absorption or, receiving the load of a weight, and how we coach that. The speed of contracting, relaxing quickly to be able to move fast, pulling under a bar, all these different things we can talk about how that applies to athletics, right? Mm-hmm. Jumping, cutting, kicking, throwing, running, all these different things. And then also just the skill aspect of it, I think is a huge part too, right? What do our athletes do at practice? My athletes go to practice and they learn a skill, a technique, right? My track jumpers, they go to the long jump pit and their coach sits there and they do approach runs and he analyzes their technique and how many steps they're taking and where they need to start from and what foot they're taking off of and where their arms and their legs are going in the air. And right, there's a technique to everything in sport, right? Pitchers are learning a technique of their delivery and different, grips on the ball, and golfers are learning the technique of a swing or a posture and a stance position or something like that. There's a technique and a skill component to all of sports. So I think one really overlooked aspect of weightlifting is just the fact that it is a very skilled movement, right? And so I think there's a benefit from athletes learning a skill in the weight room, just like they learn a skill at practice.
Yeah.
And so I don't think what we do in the weight room should be mindless. I think you're learning a skill. And I kind of present it that way and approach it that way so that they understand that, hey, I want their attention, first and foremost. I want them to pay attention and focus on what we're doing because it is a skill and it's going to involve thought. It's not just mindlessly lifting weights. Yep. And then from there, I just approach it on an individual basis. So I have a teaching progression. I teach from basically the receiving position of each lift down to the start position, which eventually would be from the floor, but we have a bunch of different ways to modify where the lift can start from. So the receiving position of the clean is obviously a front squat or a front rack. So that's what we work on first. And a lot of times with cleans, what I've found in athletes across the board is that's the number one hurdle for people is the front rack position. Yep. So we'll work on it. We'll work on the mobility needed. We'll work on front squatting. We'll work on 2 fingers under the bar, 3 fingers under the bar, maybe no fingers under the bar, your hands, out straight or whatever to start. So we just progress through that. If there's injury or like a legitimate medical issue why they can't be in certain positions, obviously I'm going to find something else for them to do. But if there's not, then I want them to progress towards being able to do it because I know it's going to benefit them. It's not just I don't like it, I don't want to do it, so I'm not going to do it. So that's the first thing, and then I progress from the top down approach basically. So we teach a high hang position from the hip, and then we'll go down to below the knee, a hang position just below the knee. Mm-hmm. I'm not a huge fan there. I think there's a benefit for weightlifting athletes for above knee work once they understand the lifts more. Right. But when I'm teaching someone to lift, even a weightlifter, I like to do my hang work from what we call position 2, which is a hang below the knee, because it teaches them to navigate the knees and move back and forth and get the stretch on the hamstrings and be able to hinge and squat and do those things that are required when you're deadlifting or, pulling from blocks below the knee or eventually going from the ground. I think there's benefit to navigating and learning that movement. And I think in my experience, when you only do a bunch of above knee work, you can kind of get into some cheating positions that don't really help you when you go below the knee. So somebody might be able to hang clean 100 kilos above the knee, no problem. And then you tell them to go below the knee and they don't know what the heck's going on. They can do 60 or 70.
Right.
And then same thing with the snatch as well. We'll teach, from the top down. And honestly, I teach them the receiving position. I teach them the starting position, the posture I want. And I tell them to jump and catch. I tell them to use their legs, drive the bar vertically as hard as they can, and finish and move fast. And then we work on, 0.9% of athletes are going to catch in a power to start with anyways, with just a minimal knee and hip flexion. And so then we'll work on, the aspect of kind of pulling your body under the weight. And for athletes, I don't ever teach them you have to catch this at the very bottom, right, at the bottom of a squat, like a weightlifter should. But I do want them to get the aspect and the feeling of, the coordination and timing of using your legs, using your arms, and pulling your body into the receiving position, relaxing, being fast, and then tensing and bracing for the load, and being ready for it when you catch it. And so we do different things. Like every day we do a weightlifting movement. We'll do a complex to warm up with just an empty bar. And so for cleans, I'll do what I call pull unders for cleans. And so that's where they start on their toes or a tall clean. Sometimes Greg Everett for Catalyst calls them that, but you'll start on your toes with your legs straight and then you'll just work on pulling under into the receiving position. So it's just kind of that last part of the lift. And so that's how I teach the weightlifting movements. But like I said, if there's a part of that where someone has an issue where they can't, yes, I'll use pulls. Or if someone has an injury, because of practice or competition or whatever, they can't do a certain aspect of it. Maybe there's a wrist injury or an elbow injury or a shoulder thing and they can't catch a lift. That's fine. But I'll do pulls during that period of time. I've also done just even things like medicine ball throws, weighted jumps, like you were saying, whether it's with a trap bar or dumbbells or something like that, some other type of plyometric or something. They're not all the same. I understand that, but I think for the aspect of we're looking for a fast, explosive movement, then I kind of will work those things in. Sometimes I'll use loaded jumps and medicine ball work in addition to weightlifting, in certain periods of the season. I'll use those with my track athletes a lot of times later in the week when we're closer to a meet or something. So we might do snatches or cleans on Monday and Tuesday, and then maybe Wednesday or Thursday, we might do some medicine ball work or some lightly loaded jumps, or maybe we might use some dumbbells or kettlebells to load the eccentric portion of a jump and then drop them and do a box jump or something like that. And I use that as a little bit more of kind of like a nervous system, just to get them a stimulus of something, but it's not very taxing to fatigue them. It's not going to make them sore, but they're moving something fast and quick instead of just not training the back half of every week for 15 weeks during track season. And kind of leading into the meet and it's for my track kids, it's good. And it depends on the sport and the athlete, but they just like to do fast things anyway. So it makes them feel better. So I think there's a component of that too.
Psychological aspect because they're already twitchy. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely.
And I think that's the funny thing too, is I think there's a lot of people out there that want like a definitive answer for everything forever and always. And by and large, it's dependent. It depends on the situation. It depends on the athlete, because, for example, if you're teaching the clean and you're having kids go from hang power clean or whatever, you might give them different supplementary work because of where they're deficient or where the breakdown occurs. If you have the luxury of being in a small group or whatever, but there's just too much of the time people are like, well, it has to be X, Y, Z. So
right.
I don't know. It all depends on what you're after.
Yeah, and I think you can do things like look at the you can look at velocities you're working with, right? And you can another thing that a lot of times people don't. And on social media, when it's you either do Olympic lifts or you don't. Well, we're just saying a category of exercises with weightlifting, right? And Olympic lifts. Yeah. So we're talking about tools. Well, we haven't even talked about load prescription and volume and intensity, right? So it's like I can do a clean. If my best clean's 100 kilos. I can do a clean at 30 kilos or I can do a clean at 100 kilos, right? Just like a squat, right? We say a squat is an exercise. Well, it all depends on what we're doing, like what are the volumes and intensities? What's the velocity of the movement if you want to look at that, and what adaptation are we looking for? And then how are we going to use this tool to get it? And so I think that's another thing where people, if I have an athlete that's trained and somewhat proficient in weightlifting, they should be able to handle in a movement like the clean a larger load and potentially move it hopefully at faster speeds than maybe like a trap bar jump, right? Like move the same load at faster speed, right? So I should be able to clean 100 kilos faster than I could jump with 100 kilos on a trap bar. And so I think that's another thing is looking at, like, if I'm doing loaded jumps with an athlete, then I'm probably going to maybe err on the lighter side, and I might be looking for a little bit more velocity, like on that movement, like I'm probably not, just me personally, people might be different, they've done it. I'm probably not going to have someone do 100 kilo loaded jump because just if they land the wrong way or something, something that's just, and like I said, maybe I just don't do it enough to feel comfortable, but I'm just not going to do that. And so that's kind of out. So that tool in my toolbox of loaded jumping would be more on the higher, velocity end of the spectrum and lower on the absolute load. Whereas something like a clean would be something that obviously I can prescribe it to be lighter and faster as well, but it gives me the option to go a little bit heavier and potentially a little bit slower. Same thing with like a snatch or a jerk versus, a snatch versus a clean, or a jerk versus a clean, or a jerk versus a push press. Yep. The tool and the exercise and the movement I'm doing is going to dictate a little bit of my prescription range and like the velocity range I might be looking at. So a lot of times personally, I like to use cleans on more like strength focused or heavier intensity days or potentially lower body days. And then I like to use snatches and jerks more on, an upper body day, if that's what my programming is like, or just a lighter, more explosive day, because those movements are going to be lighter and faster, especially when I'm talking about my athletes. We're looking at snatching anywhere from 30 to 60 kilos, 30 on the low end for some of my female athletes, up to 60 for my guys for, singles and doubles. Whereas cleans, we're going to be more like 40 or 50 up to 100, 110, 120, just for who I'm working with right now. And so those velocities are going to be a lot different. My peak velocity on a snatch is most likely going to be 2.5 to 3. And my peak velocity on a clean is most likely going to be 1.5 to 2. So I've got a decent gap in the range there. And so I think that's another thing that's kind of not always discussed in depth when we think about these things, is it's just kind of thrown out there like you have to use this or that. Just like you said, I think it's a tool, and then how are you going to use it?
Yeah, 100%. Like this morning with the group that I was working with, so being more tactical side, short term when I'm working with these guys, it's a little bit different situation, but there were two guys that came up to me today and couldn't do, I had a clean complex just to get loose, warm up with nothing heavy, where it was, hang power clean, front squat, push press. and just 1+1+1. And 2 guys couldn't do it because of shoulder issues or whatever they have going on. And they ended up doing X-banded jump squats. And that's just because there's legitimately 50 of them in a group. So at the time, that's just what we could do and still get the fast stimulus that I was after. So anyway, but yeah, it's now with the velocity profiles, are you going off of like Dr. Brian Mann's velocity profile? Is that how you're determining that, or is that just more of like your own experimentation? That's what you've noticed?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both.
Okay.
I actually, with my athletes right now, I don't do like a velocity profile on their weightlifting movements. I just kind of, at the beginning of the semester, especially with the newer athletes that I'm teaching, we'll go over the technique and the progression. And when they get to the point where they're doing some of the lifts, I can keep an eye and track what they're moving, what speed they're moving certain weights at. And I'll usually just in the session prescribe that based on how it looks. And then I can go back after the fact and see, okay, well, what did she do her 40 kilo, cleans with, and, how fast was she moving the bar, et cetera, et cetera. Same thing with snatches and jerks. And then I will use those numbers a lot of times, like I said, when it's closer to competition, especially for track. And we used to do this with football too, but closer to competition, use some of those velocity prescriptions to minimize maybe the intensity on certain days and then emphasize the speed. So I'll just, if we're doing, like we had an indoor meet a couple weeks ago, and the Thursday before the meet, we did some position 2 or hang snatches, and we were staying above 2.8 meters per second. So that's just kind of on the faster end. And so that just by giving that prescription to them, and there's a few of them that I'll alter it because height does play a factor. The taller you are, the faster you're going to move the bar. So some of the shorter ones, I'll have them come down, a tenth of a meter per second or so. But when I give that prescription, then I'm just looking at, kind of putting a cap on the weight they can use because they have to move it at a certain speed. But I will use more of a full velocity profile for bench press and squat. So we'll do. It's similar. I've read a lot of Brian Mann stuff, but I got this out of a book called Force.
Oh yeah, the new one with Dan.
No, not that one. Goodness gracious, that's a whole nother podcast on that one. But
I want to talk to him, man.
Yeah, I would like to talk to him too. I think it would be interesting I want to see him coach. That's what I want to do. A lot of these people that write books, I want to see him coach. I want to be like, not with him knowing me. I want to be like a fly on the wall in the weight room. Yeah. And I want to see him coach his athletes and see what he does. I'm going to find this because it's going to bother me now. Here, Force and Power.
Who's that by?
Maximizing. So the title is Force and Power, Maximizing Performance with Velocity-Based Training. It is written by Tony Giuliano and Ty Terrell.
Okay.
I got the idea. I want to say I got the idea from Will Fleming.
Yeah.
And then I've used it for several years now. I have several other coaches I know that have used it. And basically it's a velocity profile where you start with an unloaded body weight counter movement jump, and then you work up in the squat, or if you do a bench press, obviously you don't do a jump, but in the squat you do a counter movement jump, and then you work all the way up to, the way I do it with my athletes is I work up to something that's probably about 90% or so. And it depends, it gets kind of hard because especially with athletes that are more elastic, it gets hard because you could say, if you read the literature, you're like, oh, well, your 1 rep max squat should be at 0.3 meters per second, right? And your bench press should be military press should be about 0.15. Deadlift would be similar to that. Well, I've got I've dealt with plenty of athletes that can't squat anything under about 0.55, right? Like if it's slower than that, they're missing it. And if they're not missing it, it's going to be fast, right? Like it's just boom. Whereas people like me can do some slower reps and kind of grind through. And so it really depends on the person, but I'll just kind of have them work up to what I feel like is a heavyish weight, the 85 to preferably 90% range of what I feel like, if you don't have a number, you don't know the percentage, but that kind of perceived effort or that velocity. And then you just look at the relationship between the slope of their line and their jump. And then what they do is they have the equation, everything in there, and they relate it to, they put them in two groups called a gorilla or a kangaroo. So the gorilla is kind of like your strong force. Yeah. They call it a force-based athlete. So that's like your strong athlete. That's able to grind through some reps, can produce high levels of force, but they don't do very well in the velocity end of the spectrum. And they probably aren't great at the stretch shorten cycle or activities similar to that, like elastic, jumping, reactive movement, things like that, that require shorter ground contact times and faster contraction velocities. And so a lot of times they'll, that's that category. And then the kangaroo is the other category, which is more elastic athletes that are obviously more on the velocity end of the spectrum and less on the like slow force production.
So I would be on like the C group, which would be like the sloth group, most likely. Yeah. Because like neither. But
right. Yeah.
But yeah, I think what I've seen from Will Fleming that you're talking about is where he's doing he does a muscle snatch. I think it's like 50%, which ends up being like, I don't know, 50 or 60 kilos of muscle snatch, and he'll muscle snatch that every day, and then figure out what his expectations are based on that. So, like with my guys, what I'm doing right now is more of a conjugate style. So we have purely like every day it's total body. One day is power exclusively, one day is strength exclusively, and Friday is more of a hypertrophy, kind of underdeveloped muscle groupings. But anyway, for a while, I was playing around with, I was talking to Dr. Chris Tabor, and gave me this idea of just a simple stoplight system. So basically they come in and they do 3 max effort vertical jumps. So you track their vert jump over time, and then whenever they break that, it's a green light day, which means we're gonna go. So we might add in some extra sets or chase a little bit heavier than intended because of whatever reasons, but they're feeling really good. Where if they drop off 5% of their best, then it's going to be a yellow day. So we might drop a set, add a rep kind of thing. And then if they're dropping off 10% or more, it's a red light where we're going to drop 2 sets but add 2 reps. So then it auto regulates intensities and volumes over time. And something else I've been playing with is and I'm sure you've done the same thing and have noticed the same thing, is like with very competitive athletes, it's one of those things where you need to select exercises that force them to restrict how much weight they're going to lift, because all of them are wanting to change or chase weight, Mm-hmm. So I've started adding in exercises that are so novel to them where even though they want to max out or push hard, they can't chase too heavy because it's so new to them. But I mean, is that anything where you'll structure that throughout the week or anything?
Yeah. So I've done some similar stuff this time. Last year, I actually did a similar kind of breakdown, but I did it kind of almost, I got it from Christian Thibodeau, but it was almost like a 3 total body days, but it was structured a little bit more on like muscle contraction, almost like triphasic type. So there was more of an eccentric focus day, there was an isometric focus day, and then there was just a more concentric, like normal or explosive repetition kind of focus day. And then he also had like a 4th day in there with kind of like what you were saying of like the underdeveloped muscle group kind of hypertrophy work in there. And I kind of like that. One thing that I will do now, we have the ability to track velocity at each of our racks for barbell movements. And so I'll do what you were saying with kind of like trying to mitigate the people that want to maybe add weight all the time or competitive, people, I'll have them compete on like velocity or power output. And so we'll do that. Like I'll make a little graphic or whatever. And if it's like, 75% bench press or, 65% squat with chains, we'll compete on velocity. And then I'll, once the session's over, I'll go back and look and I'll rank them all from fastest to slowest and like put it up out by the track or in the lounge or locker room or something. And that way it's kind of like it gets them competitive, but it gets them to work on, hey, like I don't want to do 60% today. We're not getting any better. It's like, well, this is the stimulus I want for the day. So let's compete on the, how fast you can move it, stuff like that. So very similar. Yeah.
There was something at Ball State where we would do, and we would set it up where basically like once you could keep, the rules were like you could keep going up in weight and you could hold and perform as many sets as you can until we see, a velocity drop off of, whatever it was, 0.25, 0.5 meters per second in 2 subsequent sets. So it's almost like a game of force, like, all right, that was your one. Like if you drop this one, you're done, and then moving on. Yeah. So depending on work capacity, one guy might have 10 sets, one guy might have 3 or whatever. But anyway, well, hey man, I know you got to get rolling with your next group. So I want to respect your time and get you out of here. But anyway, thank you very much for coming on and chatting for a few. I'd definitely like to do this again sometime and dive into
absolutely.
Deeper. So, but man, where are you at on social media? Where can people reach out to you and that kind of thing?
You can, my weightlifting team is just True Strength Performance on Instagram. So you can check us out there. Sometimes I'm not the best. I need to be better about like daily or 5 or 6 days a week, put something out on that. But I definitely post there multiple times a week. My personal Instagram is sjyoung29, but you might just get like pictures of like my daughter or just random thoughts I have. So I try not to post videos of me lifting anymore because nobody wants to see an old man lift anymore. But yeah, that's probably where you can find me the easiest. So,
all right, cool. Well, thanks again, and I'll talk to you later.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Yep. See ya.
All right. See ya.